This country had been here 25 years when we went to Iran.
Did you have any, you thought you were going back to meet the relatives that you
I
never
thought
met?
I'm going for 2 weeks to meet his family and come back home.
I'm Whisper Files, I'm new to YouTube, and my channel features murder cases, horror, and documentaries. All the videos I make are based on real cases. If you've subscribed, let's get started. In the late 1970s, Betty, an American living in Michigan, was leading a quiet and orderly life with her Iranian husband, Dr. Said Bozorg Mahmoody. The couple, who married in 1977, had a daughter named Mahtob, referred to as Mahtob in the story, in 1979. Said was a successful anesthesiologist in America. Betty took care of the household and focused on her family. Everything was going well until the summer of 1984, when Said expressed his desire to travel to Iran on the pretext of visiting his family, whom he had not seen for a long time. At that time, the Iran-Iraq war was ongoing, and anti-American sentiment was quite strong in the country. Although Betty was concerned about the idea of going to Iran under these circumstances, she couldn't resist her husband's insistence. She tried to suppress her unease with Said's reassuring words. So, in August 1984, when Mahtob was only 4 years old, they set off on a planned 2-week visit. After a long flight, they landed safely at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. From the very first moment, Betty and her daughter experienced a shock due to cultural differences. Relatives welcomed them with great enthusiasm. Betty was given a coat and headscarf to wear when going outside. All the women on the street were covered. Unfamiliar eyes turned to them. Betty found herself in an environment governed by social rules she had never encountered before. When they arrived at the family home, the cultural differences became even more apparent. At first, the relatives behaved respectfully and showed affection to little Mahtob. However, Betty knew neither the language nor the customs. She couldn't figure out how to behave and had difficulty communicating. Said's sister, Bukala, on the other hand, displayed a distant and condescending attitude toward Betty, driven by nationalist sentiments. Betty struggled to adapt to many things, from hygiene conditions to daily habits. Her daughter Mahtob was bewildered, unaccustomed to the crowded family environment. As the days passed, mother and daughter eagerly awaited the end of the vacation and their return home. But there was something they didn't know. This return would happen much later than they had planned. As the second week of the visit approached, Betty began packing her bags. There was only 1 day left until their return flight. The strict rules in Iran, especially the system based on Sharia law, were both foreign and exhausting for her. For example, going out without a headscarf was punishable by dozens of lashes, something completely unknown to Betty. Just as everything was settled, Said took an unexpected stance. With a cold expression, he said, "This is my country. We will live here now." Betty couldn't believe what she was hearing. She cried, protested, shouted, but Said was adamant. The legal system in Iran supported this determination. The age of marriage for girls had recently been lowered from 18 to 9, which increased Betty's fear, considering her own daughter. In response to Betty's helpless reactions, Said finally succumbed to his anger and slapped her. Little Mahtob witnessed her father behaving this way for the first time. Betty, on the other hand, was shaken by this behavior from the husband she knew to be loving. What happened that night marked the beginning of a long period of captivity for Betty and her daughter. American Betty and her young daughter Mahtob suddenly found themselves in a completely foreign country, surrounded by strangers and alongside a man they no longer recognized, Said. Shortly after arriving in Iran, Betty became seriously ill. The stress and fear she experienced left her bedridden with a high fever for days. She couldn't eat or drink. During this time, little Mahtob never left her mother's bedside. Betty was so terrified that she warned her daughter, "If your father tries to give me an injection, stop him." Her fear had reached the point of paranoia. Although she eventually recovered physically, Betty realized that her circumstances were not temporary, that they were now living in a kind of captivity. Her husband's family began to guard the door of the house to prevent the mother and daughter from escaping in Sate's absence. She was only allowed to contact her family in America in the manner specified by Sate. Betty was forced to tell her family that she would stay in Iran for a while longer of her own accord. The real hardship for Betty began after that. Under Sharia law, she was forbidden to go out alone. Even if a man was with her, she could be punished if a single strand of her hair was visible. She couldn't travel alone, and working was also illegal. Moreover, Sate had taken her passport and ID. They were forced to live in a house shared with Sate's extended family. Betty, who was looked down upon by the elders of the family, was forced to obey and serve. During a phone call, her family noticed a change in Betty's tone of voice and realized she was being held against her will. In one of these conversations, Betty secretly obtained the address and phone number of the American office in Tehran. She decided to go there at the first opportunity, taking her daughter with her. Sate's behavior had become increasingly harsh during this period. After arriving in Iran, he had become like a different person, frequently scolding Betty and physically abusing her. Such behavior was not frowned upon under Iranian law at the time, which gave husbands complete authority over their families. One day, while Sate was away from home, Betty managed to secretly go to the American office, taking Mahtob with her. There, she met an employee named Helen and asked for help, saying, "Save us. We are being held here against our will." However, Helen had to deliver the bad news. According to Iranian law, a foreign woman who marries an Iranian man automatically becomes an Iranian citizen, and she needed her husband's official permission to leave the country. US citizenship was not valid here. These words were devastating for Betty. She helplessly took her daughter and returned home. Sate was waiting for them at the door, furious. Betty was locked in her room, while Mahtob was handed over to family members. The little girl was asked if her mother had an escape plan, but her mother had instructed her to say, "We just went for a trip." After this 2-week room punishment, Betty was allowed to move around the house, but she now realized the situation. Escape through legal means was impossible. Leaving her daughter there was also out of the question. That meant they had to make an escape plan through illegal means. What was initially planned as a 2-week visit stretched to nearly a year with all these difficulties. Until mid-1985, Betty and Mahtob lived under constant surveillance. She could only go outside when accompanied by a man, wearing a thick coat and headscarf. Once, she was even scolded by neighbors for appearing alone in front of the house. The only time she had access to the outside world was when she went to the market accompanied by a man. At home, she was often surrounded by people speaking a language she did not understand. Even the sounds of bombs she heard in Tehran's nights had become part of daily life. Little Mahtob had to get used to these bombings, in addition to the headscarf she was forced to wear. Betty would cry silently in the bathroom, the only place she could be alone. Sate, meanwhile, had returned to his medical practice, acting as if his life in America had never happened. Years later, he confessed to Betty that he had already lost his job in America. One reason for returning to Iran was his desire to regain his lost reputation. The truth behind Betty's year-and-a-half-long forced stay was slowly coming to light. Of course, no reason could justify what she had been through. As the days passed, she had become so cautious that she whispered even inside the house, having learned that the slightest mistake could lead to dire consequences. Her only consolation was her little girl, Mahtob, whom she tried to cheer up by saying, "One day we'll go back home." Although her previous attempt to work for the American office had failed, it hadn't extinguished Betty's hope. On the contrary, she understood that she had to wait patiently to make an escape plan. So she began to project an obedient image to the outside world. She never disobeyed her husband, never showed disrespect to her elders, and followed the rules to the letter. This attitude gradually increased both Sate's and his family's trust in her. Over time, Sate also softened. Seeing that Betty seemed to be adapting, the decision was made to move into a separate house. Getting away from the pressure of her large, extended family was a big step for her. Living in a place where she felt more free with her daughter allowed her to think about her plans more calmly. She even gained enough freedom to go to the market alone sometimes when Sate was working intensely. This was a small but very valuable change in her life. One day, in a clothing store she entered at the market, she met a salesman named Hamid. Hamid had been to America in the past. He noticed from her accent that Betty was a foreigner and sensed her situation. He told her she could use the store's phone if she wanted. This offer was a great opportunity for Betty, but the slightest carelessness could ruin everything. This time, fate smiled on her a little. One day, when she took Mahtob to the park, she met another American woman named Judy. Judy was married to an Iranian man, but unlike Betty, she had come here willingly. She had adapted to the culture over time and established good relationships with those around her. When she heard Betty's story, she was horrified. Unlike her situation, Betty was clearly being held captive. Judy felt sorry for the woman and thought something had to be done. She decided to use her connections to help Betty. When they met again a few days later, Judy gave Betty the phone number of a smuggler named Rashid. This man could be a ray of hope for her. During a routine visit to the market, Betty called Rashid from Hamid's phone and told him her story. Her story was so moving that even Rashid was affected. The escape plan was theoretically possible, but the biggest obstacle was Mahtob. It was very risky for a small child to cross the mountains in harsh winter conditions. Weeks later, the news confirmed this concern. The smugglers said a small child would not be able to endure the journey. Betty was devastated. The plan she had pinned all her hopes on seemed to have fallen through. Then, in January 1986, news from America both delighted Betty and plunged her into a deep dilemma. Her father, Harold, was seriously ill. Doctors said his days were numbered. Upon hearing this news, Sate surprisingly softened and told Betty he would allow her to go to America, but that Mahtob would remain in Iran. This was an indescribable dilemma for a mother. Either she would see her dying father one last time, but leave her daughter behind, or she would stay with her daughter and never see her father again. Betty made her decision based on her maternal instinct. She would not leave her daughter behind. "Never without my daughter," she said. And then the unexpected moment came. On January 29th, 1986, Sate was called to the hospital urgently. Betty did not miss this opportunity. She quickly went to the market and reached Rashid. This time she was completely determined. She said she was willing to face the harsh winter conditions, the mountains, and the dangers. Although Rashid hesitated, her determination set the plan in motion. On the morning of January 31st, Betty and Mahtob secretly left their home with a few belongings they could carry. Smugglers took them away from Tehran in a vehicle. Before evening, they reached a small village near Tabriz. Betty took her daughter and got into the car of men she didn't know, setting off into the unknown. In the middle of winter, without money, the only thing she could rely on was her courage. The next morning, they set off on horseback toward the snowy mountains on the Iran-Turkey border. The cold penetrated their bones, the wind whipped their faces, and Mahtob clung tightly to her mother. Together with the man guiding them, they managed to cross the Turkish border after a grueling 15-hour journey. They hid from patrols, crossed minefields, but miraculously, nothing went wrong. When they arrived in Turkey, no one was waiting for them, but the land was free. The smuggler put the mother and daughter on a bus the next morning and sent them to the city center. They were now on their own, but people in Turkey helped them. They managed to explain their situation and reached the bus station, from where they traveled to Ankara on a long journey. In the first days of February, Betty and Mahtob couldn't hold back their tears when they arrived at the US Embassy. After a year of captivity, they were finally free. Betty had made this difficult escape, saying, "Never without my daughter." When she returned to Michigan, she was able to see her father alive. She then filed for divorce from sight, closing the darkest chapter of her life. In 1989, she was named Mother of the Year, and in 1990, Woman of the Year. Mother and daughter have been living together ever since. That's all from me this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please remember that I do all the work on this channel by myself and can only make it happen with your likes and comments. See you on Whisper Files. As always, take care until the next video.